I've always thought of myself as a pretty laid-back guy. Claire and I had been married for 7 years, and while things weren't as exciting as they were in the early days, I thought we were solid. We had our routines, weeknight dinners, Saturday movie nights, and the occasional argument over something stupid like leaving the lights on. Nothing unusual, or so I thought. But over the last couple of months, Claire had changed in ways I couldn't ignore. It started small, almost subtle. She started dressing up more, even for the simplest errands, like grocery shopping or running to the pharmacy. She'd spend extra time in front of the mirror, choosing outfits like she was heading to a party instead of grabbing milk. When I asked about it, she'd laugh it off, saying, "Can't a woman want to look nice?" Sure, she could, but something about it felt off. Then came the errands. Claire suddenly had a lot of them, and they always seemed to happen in the evenings when she'd normally be home. She'd grab her keys and throw a casual, "Be back soon," over her shoulder without offering much detail. Again, I told myself not to overthink it. She was probably just enjoying some alone time. The part that really got under my skin, though, was her new friendship with Eric, our neighbor. Eric was the kind of guy you'd imagine hosting backyard barbecues and telling dad jokes to anyone who'd listen. He lived with his wife, Michelle, and their 2 kids just across the street. He was friendly enough, but I'd never really spent much time with him beyond the occasional wave or small talk. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to be spending a lot of time chatting with him lately. I'd find them talking in the yard or laughing over some joke I wasn't in on. It wasn't just that they were friendly. It was the kind of inside jokes and lingering glances that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't help but notice how Eric seemed to light up whenever Claire was around, and how she had this overly bright smile whenever she talked to him. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Claire had never given me a reason to doubt her. But then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't shake. I'd gotten off work earlier than expected and pulled into the driveway, noticing the garage door was slightly open. Inside, I saw Claire and Eric standing together. They were close, too close for my liking. She was holding one of my tools, twirling it in her hands like it was the most fascinating thing in the world, while Eric was leaning against the workbench, smiling in that easy, confident way of his. They were laughing at something I couldn't hear. The second they noticed me, it was like a switch flipped. Claire's laughter cut off, and Eric stepped back like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out. His face went red, and he mumbled some excuse about needing to get back home. Claire, on the other hand, brushed past me with a nervous smile and said something about needing to start dinner. I didn't say anything. What could I say without sounding crazy? But the whole scene felt wrong. Claire was acting jumpy, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. And Eric? He couldn't get out of there fast enough. My gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right, but I pushed it down. Maybe it really was innocent. Maybe I was just imagining things. Still, that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman I thought I knew so well was keeping secrets. Little did I know, that moment in the garage was just the tip of the iceberg. After that moment in the garage, I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. It gnawed at me. Claire's nervous smile, Eric's flushed face, the way they had been standing just a little too close, like they were sharing a secret no one else was meant to know. It wasn't just a one-off feeling anymore. Something was definitely wrong, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Claire's errands seemed to multiply overnight. Every evening, it was something new. A quick trip to the store, picking up a package, or needing to clear her head. Each time she left, I'd watch her drive off, my stomach twisting tighter. She was acting carefree, too carefree, like someone who didn't think they'd ever get caught. Then there was Eric. He suddenly seemed to pop up everywhere. I'd catch him walking his dog near our house or lingering by his mailbox, just waiting for Claire to step outside. They had their little chats, ones I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. The way they'd laugh, lean toward each other, and exchange those quick glances when they thought no one was watching. It made my blood boil. One evening, about a week after the garage incident, Claire told me she needed to pick up something for the house. She didn't say what, and I didn't ask. Instead, I decided to follow her. It felt insane, like I was starring in some bad soap opera, but I couldn't sit around pretending everything was fine anymore. I waited a few minutes after she left and then hopped in my truck. I didn't have to go far. She drove a short distance down the street and parked right outside Eric's house. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. There was no pretense, no attempt to hide it. She just walked right up to his door and let herself in like she belonged there. I sat in my truck, staring at that door, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they shook. A part of me wanted to storm in and demand answers right then and there, but another part of me, the part that didn't want to look like a crazy, paranoid husband, held me back. Instead, I waited. After what felt like an eternity, Claire came out. She wasn't carrying anything, no household item she had supposedly gone to pick up. Her hair was slightly mussed, and she was smoothing down her dress as she walked back to the car. She had that same overly bright smile plastered on her face as she drove home, as if she hadn't just spent an hour inside another man's house. I followed at a distance, making sure she didn't see me. By the time I got home, she was already inside, acting like nothing had happened. She was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables for dinner. "Got everything you needed?" I asked casually, leaning against the doorway. She looked up, her expression calm and unbothered. "Yeah, just a quick stop. Nothing exciting." I nodded, forcing myself to act normal, but inside, I was seething. I wanted to demand answers, to lay everything out on the table right then and there, but I knew I needed more. My gut told me this wasn't just some harmless flirtation or misunderstanding. I needed proof, something solid that she couldn't lie her way out of. That night, as Claire slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. If she was betraying me, and all signs were pointing that way, I wouldn't just sit back and let it happen. This was far from over. The next morning, things felt different. Claire was chipper, humming a tune as she got ready for the day. But to me, her smile felt fake, forced. She had no idea I had seen her walk out of Eric's house the night before, and that knowledge gave me a strange sense of power. Still, I didn't know how to confront her yet. Every bone in my body wanted to shout, "What the hell were you doing at Eric's?" But something held me back. I wanted undeniable proof, something she couldn't worm her way out of. That proof came sooner than I expected. Claire had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she stepped into the bathroom. Normally, I wouldn't touch her phone. It was her business, and I didn't feel the need to snoop. But after everything I'd seen, I couldn't resist. As soon as I picked it up, the screen lit up with a notification. It was a message from Eric. "Eric, last night was so risky, but I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped. There it was, in black and white. No more guessing, no more doubt. It wasn't just some innocent friendship or playful banter. This was real. My wife and our neighbor were having an affair. Before I could read anything else, Claire's footsteps echoed down the hall. My heart pounded as I quickly set the phone back on the counter and moved to the sink, pretending to rinse a glass. She walked in, her hair damp, and gave me that same sweet, clueless smile. "What are you up to?" she asked, casually picking up her phone. She didn't even notice my shaky hands. "Just cleaning up a bit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's on your agenda today?" "Oh, just errands," she said, glancing at her screen. For a split second, her expression faltered. Her thumbs swiped quickly, and I knew she was deleting the text. She turned back to me, her smile perfectly in place. Nothing exciting. That was it. I couldn't keep playing dumb anymore. I had seen enough, and I wasn't going to let her lie to my face like this. Later that evening, when she was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, I decided to confront her. I didn't plan a speech or rehearse what I was going to say. I just went for it. "Claire," I started, standing in the doorway. My tone was calm, but inside, I was anything but. "I saw your messages with Eric." Her head snapped up, her face going pale. For a moment, she looked genuinely stunned. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened, and she set her phone down with a sigh. "You've been spying on me? Don't even try to turn this around." I shot back. "What's going on between you and Eric?" She crossed her arms, her defensive walls going up immediately. "Nothing's going on. He sent me a dumb message, and I didn't even respond. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I couldn't keep my voice from rising. I saw you walking out of his house last night. You weren't picking up anything for the house, were you?" She froze for a moment, then laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my blood boil. "You're being ridiculous, Ryan. I went over there to borrow something for dinner. That's all." "Claire, I'm not stupid," I said, my voice low and steady. "I saw the text. I saw the way he looked at you in the garage. I've been watching you, and I know something's going on. So just tell me the truth." For a split second, I thought she might crack, that she might actually tell me what was happening. But instead, she doubled down. "Eric's been flirting with me, okay?" she said, throwing her hands up. "But I didn't do anything. I didn't ask for his attention, and I definitely didn't encourage it. He's the one who's being inappropriate, not me." I stared at her, trying to process her words. Was she really trying to pin this all on Eric? The man who just happened to text her about how he couldn't stop thinking about her. The man whose house she had been sneaking into? It didn't add up, and she knew it. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked, my voice cold. "That you're just an innocent victim in all of this?" "Yes," she insisted, her voice rising. "Why would I throw away our marriage over some stupid crush? Ryan, you're blowing this way out of proportion." I didn't buy it. Not for a second. But I knew I wouldn't get the truth out of her. Not yet. Claire was too good at lying, too good at twisting the narrative to suit her. If I wanted to unravel the full story, I'd need to go deeper. And I would. This wasn't over. The morning after our tense conversation, I felt like I was living with a stranger. Claire went about her routine like nothing had happened, humming as she made breakfast and scrolling through her phone as if our argument the night before had been about something trivial. Meanwhile, I sat across from her, trying to figure out my next move. Her lies stuck in my head like an endless loop. Eric was just flirting? She was innocent? I knew better. Her defensiveness, her attempts to turn the tables, and that damn text. All of it screamed guilt. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to hit harder. She needed to face the truth, and I wasn't going to let her slither out of this one. The opportunity came that evening. I waited until after dinner, when she was settling into the couch with her glass of wine. She seemed relaxed, her legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone. She hadn't noticed that I'd been quiet all evening, watching her, biding my time. "Claire," I said, standing in the doorway. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. "We need to talk." She looked up, her brows knitting together in irritation. "Again? Ryan, I told you everything last night. What more do you want?" I walked into the room and stood in front of her. "I want the truth. The real truth. Not the half-baked excuse you gave me about Eric flirting with you." Her expression hardened instantly. "I don't know what you're expecting me to say, Ryan. I've already explained." "No." I cut her off, my voice sharp. "You haven't explained anything. You've just lied and deflected, hoping I'd drop it. But I'm not dropping it, Claire. Not when I've seen the texts, the way you act around him, the fact that you were in his house last night." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked cornered, like a deer caught in headlights. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out her next move. "Fine," she said finally, setting her wine glass down with a clink. "You want the truth?" "Yes. Eric has been texting me. Yes, we've spent time together. But it's not what you think. He's been having problems in his marriage, and he needed someone to talk to." I stared at her, incredulous. "So, you're his therapist now? That's what you're going with?" She rolled her eyes. "You're twisting everything, Ryan. I was just being supportive. Michelle hasn't exactly been easy to live with, and Eric." "Don't you dare try to make this about Michelle," I snapped. "This isn't about him needing support, or you being a good neighbor. This is about you sneaking around, lying to my face, and texting things like, 'Last night was so risky.'" Her face went pale at that, and for a moment, I thought I had her. But then she did what Claire always did when backed into a corner. She lashed out. "You're so paranoid, Ryan," she yelled, standing up. "Do you even hear yourself? You're accusing me of cheating because of a couple of texts and a friendly visit to a neighbor's house? Do you know how crazy you sound?" "Crazy?" I repeated, stepping closer to her. "What's crazy is thinking I'm going to believe your bullshit after everything I've seen." The texts, the secret errands, the way you act around him. It's all right there, Claire. So stop lying and just admit it. She glared at me, her chest heaving. For a moment, I thought she might finally come clean. But instead, she shook her head and let out a bitter laugh. You're impossible, she said, grabbing her wine glass and storming out of the room. If you're so convinced I'm some kind of monster, then I don't even know why we're having this conversation. I stood there, watching her retreat into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. My fists clenched at my sides. Her lies, her excuses, her refusal to own up to what she'd done. It was infuriating. But it also made one thing crystal clear. Claire wasn't going to tell me the truth. Not willingly. If I wanted the full story, I'd have to find it myself. The next day, I woke up with a plan. Claire was never going to give me the truth. Her deflections and manipulations made that clear. But I wasn't alone in this. Eric had a wife, Michelle, who deserved to know what was happening just as much as I did. If anyone could help me piece together the full picture, it was her. I waited until Claire left for one of her mysterious errands. It was a little too convenient how often she disappeared these days. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Michelle's number. I hesitated for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Was this crossing a line? Would she even believe me? But then I thought about the text, about the way Claire had stormed off after lying to my face, and all my doubts vanished. I hit call. Michelle picked up on the second ring. Hey Ryan, what's up? Her voice was cheerful, completely unaware of what I was about to drop on her. Hey Michelle, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I was wondering if you'd have some time to talk. It's about Claire and Eric. There was a brief pause. What about them? She asked cautiously, her voice a little less cheerful now. I think it's better if we talk in person, I said. Are you free to come over? She hesitated again, but finally agreed. Sure, I'll be over in a few minutes. When she arrived, I could see the tension on her face. Michelle was one of those people who always seemed put together. Perfectly styled hair, not a single wrinkle in her clothes. But today, she looked unsettled. Like she already had a feeling about what I was going to say. I didn't waste time beating around the bush. As soon as she sat down at the dining table, I laid it all out. I told her about the text I'd seen, about Claire's strange behavior, and about the night I'd followed her to Eric's house. Michelle's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to something that looked a lot like anger. Are you sure? She asked, her voice tight. I mean, Eric, he's always been a little flirty, but I didn't think he'd actually… She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. I nodded. I'm sure, Michelle. I've seen enough to know something's going on. And if Claire's acting this way, I figured Eric might be too. For a moment, Michelle didn't say anything. She just stared at the table, her fingers drumming against the edge. Then she let out a long breath and looked up at me. You're not wrong, she said quietly. I've been suspicious of Eric for a while now. He's been staying out late, saying he's working on projects or helping friends, but it never adds up. And Claire… She hesitated, then shook her head. I've noticed how she acts around him too. At the barbecue last month, she couldn't stop laughing at his stupid jokes, and he wouldn't stop looking at her. Her words confirmed what I'd already feared, but hearing it from her made it feel even more real. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. They've been playing us both for fools. Michelle, I said, leaning forward, I think we need to confront them together. If we both push, they won't be able to lie their way out of this. She nodded slowly, her jaw set with determination. You're right. It's time we get the truth. Before she left, we made a plan. I'd confront Claire again that evening, but this time, Michelle would be there too. If Eric was involved, he wouldn't be able to hide from what was coming. As she walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread for the confrontation that lay ahead, but relief in knowing I wasn't facing it alone. Whatever happened next, Claire and Eric wouldn't be able to escape the fallout. That evening, just as planned, Michelle arrived at my house. She looked more determined this time, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet resolve. She wasn't here just for answers. She wanted justice too. I could see it in the way she held her shoulders back, her keys clutched tightly in her hand like she was bracing for a fight. Claire was already home, sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone like nothing in the world could touch her. She glanced up when Michelle walked in, her expression shifting instantly from surprise to thinly veiled panic. She set her phone down slowly, her eyes darting between us. "What's going on?" Claire asked, her voice a little too calm. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I motioned for Michelle to sit down. Once she was settled, I turned back to Claire, crossing my arms. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. "All of us." Claire's eyes narrowed. "About what?" "About you and Eric," Michelle said sharply, cutting through the pretense. "About the late-night texts, the sneaking around, and the fact that you've been lying to both of us." For a moment, Claire just stared at her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, as if flipping a switch, she plastered on her most indignant expression. "This is ridiculous," she said, laughing nervously. "I don't know what Ryan's been telling you, but nothing's going on. Eric's just a friend." Michelle scoffed. "A friend who texts you about how risky last night was? A friend you've been meeting at his house, while your husband sits here wondering where you are?" "I told Ryan," Claire began, but I cut her off. "You told me a bunch of lies," I said coldly. "You said Eric was flirting with you, that you didn't do anything to encourage it. But Michelle and I both know that's not true." Claire's face reddened, and for a moment, I thought she might finally crack. But then she shook her head, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "You're both insane," she said, standing up. "Do you even hear yourselves? You're ganging up on me because Eric made a couple of dumb comments? I can't control what he says, and I sure as hell haven't done anything to encourage him." Michelle stood too, her voice rising. "Don't even try that, Claire. I've seen how you act around him. You're always touching his arm, laughing at his jokes, finding excuses to talk to him. And let's not forget the time you practically threw yourself at him at the barbecue." Claire's eyes flashed with anger. "Oh, please. If Eric's unhappy in his marriage, that's not my fault. Maybe you should look at yourself, Michelle, instead of blaming me for your problems." The room went silent for a moment, the tension so thick it felt like the walls might crack. Michelle's hands balled into fists, and I stepped between them before things escalated further. "This isn't about Michelle," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is about you, Claire. About the way you've been lying to me, sneaking around and disrespecting our marriage." Claire's bravado faltered, but only for a second. "You have no proof," she said, crossing her arms. "You're making all these accusations, but you don't have a single shred of evidence." "Oh, really?" Michelle shot back, pulling her phone from her pocket. She scrolled for a moment before holding the screen up to Claire. "How about these screenshots? Your precious Eric likes to talk a little too much when he's drunk." Claire's face drained of color as she stared at the messages. I leaned in to look, and my stomach twisted. The texts were from Eric to another friend, bragging about his wild night with Claire and mocking me for being too clueless to notice. The words blurred together in my mind, but one line stood out. "Claire's worth the risk. She's got her husband wrapped around her finger anyway." For once, Claire had no response. She sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling. Michelle and I stood over her, waiting for her to say something, anything, but she just sat there, staring at the floor. "You've been caught," Michelle said finally, her voice ice cold. "There's no getting out of this." Claire didn't look up. She just muttered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." That was it. The final admission. My hands shook with rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. I turned to Michelle. "Thank you for bringing this," I said quietly. "I think we're done here." Michelle nodded, giving Claire one last withering glare before heading to the door. Before she left, she turned back to me. "If you need anything else, let me know," she said. "Eric's going to be hearing from me tonight." With that, she was gone, leaving me alone with Claire. She finally looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Ryan, Save it," I said, my voice cold. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Pack your things. You're leaving tonight." Claire sat there, her face pale and tear-streaked, but I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Her betrayal, her lies, They had chipped away at everything I thought I knew about our marriage. And now, finally caught, she wasn't apologizing. She was just scrambling, trying to salvage what little ground she had left to stand on. "Ryan, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk about this? Just the two of us? I made a mistake, but it doesn't mean we can't fix things." I crossed my arms and glared at her, my anger barely contained. "Fix things? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with our neighbor, and now you want to talk about fixing things? You think packing this up in a neat little apology is going to make it all go away?" Her lip quivered, but there was something behind her eyes, something calculating. Claire wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she got caught. That realization hit me like a freight train, and it only made my resolve stronger. "You don't understand," she pleaded, standing up and taking a step toward me. "Eric," he came on to me. "I didn't want any of this." He kept pushing, and I was scared to tell you because I didn't want you to think less of me. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I almost believed her. But then I remembered the text messages, the way she'd laughed with him in the garage, the countless lies she'd told me without hesitation. "Stop lying," I said, my voice cold. Michelle and I compared notes. "You weren't some helpless victim, Claire. You were an active participant in this, whatever the hell it was. So don't stand there and insult me by pretending otherwise." Her face twisted into something ugly, and just like that, the tears were gone. "Fine," she snapped, her tone sharp. "You want the truth? Yes, I slept with Eric. But maybe if you weren't so damn boring, I wouldn't have had to." The words hit me like a slap, but instead of breaking me, they fueled the fire in my chest. "Boring?" I repeated, my voice deadly calm. "You mean boring like the guy who paid all the bills, supported your dreams, and trusted you? That kind of boring?" Claire scoffed, her arms crossed. "You're acting like this is all on me, but you're not perfect, Ryan. You're always working, always distracted. Do you even remember the last time you did something romantic for me?" I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "You're unbelievable. You cheat, you lie, and now you're blaming me for it? This is exactly why we're done, Claire. I'm not wasting another second of my life on someone who doesn't respect me." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "No more excuses. No more lies. Pack your things and get out." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then, finally, she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I could hear her muttering under her breath as she threw things into a suitcase, but I didn't care. I was done. While she packed, I sat at the dining table, staring at the evidence Michelle had sent me. The texts, the photos, the damning messages. It was all there, laid out like a roadmap of betrayal. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, making sure it was documented for the divorce proceedings. I wasn't going to let Claire weasel her way out of this. About an hour later, she reappeared, dragging a suitcase behind her. She stopped in the doorway, her face a mix of defiance and desperation. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Not my problem," I said without looking up. "You made your choices, Claire. Now deal with the consequences." She stood there for a moment, like she was waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, she huffed and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, and for the first time in what felt like months, I took a deep breath. It wasn't over, not yet. There were still legal battles ahead, and I knew the fallout in the neighborhood would be brutal. But in that moment, with Claire gone and the truth finally out in the open, I felt an odd sense of relief. The worst was behind me, and now it was time to rebuild. After Claire left, the house felt eerily quiet. Her absence, while welcome, left an unmistakable void, a reminder of what had happened and how everything had unraveled so quickly. I stared at the half-empty wine glass she'd left on the coffee table, a small testament to how abruptly the facade of our marriage had shattered. But instead of sinking into the silence, I started making moves. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. I laid everything out, the texts, the evidence, and my decision to file for divorce. My lawyer, Maggie, had a reputation for being sharp and relentless, and she didn't mince words. "You've got a solid case here," she said after hearing everything. "Claire's infidelity and the documented proof will make this process pretty straightforward. It's good you're acting quickly. It'll make things cleaner in court." I hung up feeling a surge of vindication. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. I wasn't going to be the passive husband, sitting on the sidelines while my life fell apart. I was taking action, and that felt damn good. Next, I turned my attention to the neighborhood fallout. By the following morning, word had already started to spread. Michelle, true to her word, had confronted Eric that night and kicked him out. He'd been forced to crash at a friend's place, and from what I heard, it hadn't been a quiet departure. Their screaming match had echoed down the street, drawing the attention of several nosy neighbors. It didn't take long for the story to make its way through the grapevine. By mid-morning, I had a knock on my door. It was Diane, one of the neighborhood busybodies who never missed a chance to dig into drama. "Ryan," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern, "I just heard about Claire and Eric. I can't believe it. Is everything okay?" I leaned against the doorframe, forcing a polite smile. "It's a mess, Diane, but I'm handling it." Her eyes sparkled with barely concealed curiosity. "Well, if you need anything, or if you want to talk, I'm just across the street." "Thanks, Diane," I said, cutting the conversation short. "I've got a lot to take care of right now." She left, clearly disappointed, but I knew she'd be back. People like Diane thrived on gossip, and this was the juiciest story the neighborhood had seen in years. I wasn't interested in feeding the rumor mill, but I also wasn't going to hide what had happened. Let them talk. Claire and Eric deserved every ounce of judgment that came their way. By the end of the day, the neighborhood had chosen sides. Most people rallied behind me and Michelle, offering their support and condemning Claire and Eric's actions. A few, probably out of loyalty or denial, tried to defend them, but they were in the minority. Claire's carefully curated image of the perfect wife was officially in ruins. That evening, Michelle came over. She looked exhausted but determined, a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there the last time we'd spoken. "I kicked him out," she said simply, dropping into the chair across from me. He tried to deny everything at first, but when I showed him the texts, he finally admitted it. Then he had the nerve to blame me, like his cheating was somehow my fault. I nodded, unsurprised. Claire tried the same thing. It's a pattern with people like them. They can't take responsibility for their actions. Michelle sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's just humiliating, you know? To think I trusted him, built a life with him, only to find out he was sneaking around with." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Sorry, I don't mean to unload on you." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "We're both dealing with the same thing. It helps to talk about it." She gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Ryan. I'm glad I'm not going through this alone." We talked for a while longer, sharing stories and venting about the chaos Claire and Eric had brought into our lives. By the time she left, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie with her, a bond forged in betrayal. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were allies. As I locked the door behind her, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. There was still so much to do: legal proceedings, dividing assets, and rebuilding my life. But for the first time, I felt ready to face it all head-on. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was determined to write it on my terms. In the days following Claire's departure, the neighborhood turned into a pressure cooker of gossip and speculation. People weren't shy about taking sides, and the once friendly atmosphere of our cul-de-sac quickly grew tense. Claire and Eric's affair had sent ripples through the community, and those ripples were turning into full-blown waves. The support I received from most of the neighbors was overwhelming. Diane, our resident gossip, had spread the story like wildfire, and before long, everyone knew the details, or at least the juiciest bits. People stopped me on my morning walks, offering words of encouragement and promises of support. "Ryan, you're handling this so well," one neighbor, Karen, said with a sympathetic smile. "If there's anything you need, just let me know." I thanked her, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the hunger for more details. Everyone wanted to know how deep the betrayal went, and while I didn't relish being the center of attention, I didn't hold back when people asked. The truth deserved to be heard. As for Claire, she hadn't bothered to contact me since she left. I assumed she was staying with a friend or maybe renting a hotel room somewhere. Wherever she was keeping a low profile, likely because she knew she wouldn't find much sympathy around here. Every time someone brought up her name, it was with a mix of disbelief and disdain. She always seemed so perfect, Diane said during one of her not-so-subtle visits. I guess you never really know people, huh? Guess not, I replied, keeping my answers short. As much as I appreciated the support, I wasn't in the mood to entertain her theatrics. Eric, on the other hand, wasn't handling things nearly as well. Michelle had kicked him out, and I heard through the grapevine that he was staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The once charming neighbor who hosted block parties and cracked dad jokes was now a pariah. His absence was glaring, and every time his name came up, it was accompanied by whispers of disappointment and anger. Eric tried to talk to me yesterday. One neighbor, Tom, told me during a chance encounter at the mailbox. Wanted to explain himself. I told him there was nothing to explain. He messed up, plain and simple. Good for you, I said, genuinely appreciating his bluntness. The fallout wasn't just social either. Eric and Michelle had been deeply involved in the neighborhood association, organizing events and managing community budgets. Now, with their marriage imploding, Michelle stepped down from her role, citing personal reasons. Eric, unsurprisingly, was unceremoniously removed. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and while part of me hated the chaos, another part couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing justice served. But even as the neighborhood rallied around me, there were still challenges to face. Claire and I shared a lot: our house, our finances, and the life we'd built together over the years. Dividing it all was going to be messy, but I was determined to make sure she didn't get a single thing more than she deserved. My lawyer, Maggie, was on top of everything. She filed the divorce papers within days, making sure to include the evidence of Claire's infidelity. When I told her about the texts, the photos, and Michelle's corroboration, she smiled grimly. This is an airtight case, she said. Claire won't have a leg to stand on. Still, the process was emotionally exhausting. Every document I signed, every meeting with Maggie, felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I thought I had. It was hard not to dwell on the good times. Our wedding day, the vacations, the nights spent laughing over takeout. But every time those memories crept in, I reminded myself of the text message, the sneaking around, and the lies. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through the news, Michelle stopped by unannounced. She looked tired but resolute, holding a box in her hands. What's that? I asked, motioning for her to sit. It's some of Eric's stuff, she said, setting the box down on the coffee table. Things he left behind when I kicked him out. I figured you might want to see this before I throw it all away. Curious, I opened the box and started sifting through its contents. There were a few personal items, old photographs, notebooks, and a couple of receipts. But at the bottom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A stack of letters, written in Claire's handwriting. I unfolded the first one and scanned the words, my stomach twisting as I read. The letters were explicit, detailing not only the physical side of her relationship with Eric, but also her complaints about me. How I was boring, how I didn't excite her anymore, and how Eric made her feel alive. Michelle watched my reaction, her expression somber. I didn't want to find those, she said softly. But when I did, I knew you had to see them. Thank you, I managed to say, my voice tight. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the words on the page, each one a fresh wound. Claire hadn't just cheated. She'd ridiculed me, betrayed me on every level imaginable. That night, I scanned the letters and sent them to Maggie. If Claire thought she'd walk away from this unscathed, she was in for a rude awakening. The divorce process moved quickly. Between Maggie's airtight case and the mountain of evidence I'd gathered, Claire had no room to maneuver. The letters Michelle had given me turned out to be the final nail in the coffin. When Maggie presented them to Claire's lawyer, the negotiations for division of assets abruptly changed in my favor. Claire wasn't going to get a single penny more than what was fair, and certainly not what she thought she deserved. When the papers were finalized, I felt an odd mixture of relief and grief. It was like closing the door on a chapter of my life that had been both beautiful and destructive. There were still moments when I found myself staring at the empty side of the bed or catching sight of something Claire had left behind. A forgotten scarf, an old photo, and feeling a pang of sadness. But each time, I reminded myself of what she'd done, and the sadness was replaced by resolve. Meanwhile, the fallout in the neighborhood reached its peak. Eric tried to smooth things over with some of his old friends, but the reception was icy at best. Most people wanted nothing to do with him, especially after Michelle shared the truth about his affair with Claire. Even those who tried to stay neutral found themselves uncomfortable around him. He eventually moved out of the neighborhood entirely, taking a job in another city to escape the shame. Claire, on the other hand, tried to rebuild her life in the same town. It didn't go well. People avoided her at the grocery store, and her attempts to explain her side of the story were met with skepticism at best, outright hostility at worst. It was clear that her reputation was irreparably damaged. Michelle and I kept in touch throughout the process, offering each other support. There were no romantic feelings between us. It was more like a friendship forged in the trenches. She told me she was focusing on her kids and her career, finding strength in starting fresh. Her resolve inspired me to do the same. I sold the house. It was a tough decision, but I couldn't stand the memories tied to those walls. Every corner seemed to whisper of Claire's betrayal, and I needed a clean slate. With the proceeds, I bought a smaller place in the city, a modern apartment that felt like a perfect symbol of my new beginning. It was a space just for me, free of the ghosts of the past. The move gave me the push I needed to focus on myself. I threw myself into work, taking on projects I'd put off for years. I started going to the gym regularly, not just to stay busy but to feel stronger, more confident. I even signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always talked about doing but never made time for. Slowly but surely, I was building a life that was entirely my own. Therapy was another big step. At first, I'd resisted the idea. I didn't think I needed it. I wasn't broken, just angry. But my first session proved me wrong. Talking to someone who could help me untangle my emotions, who could guide me through the mess Claire had left behind, was one of the most empowering things I'd ever done. My therapist helped me see that Claire's actions weren't a reflection of my worth. Her betrayal was about her flaws, not mine. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like a new man, stronger, wiser, and, most importantly, free. The neighborhood threw a small gathering a few weeks after I moved out, partly as a farewell and partly as a way to close the chapter on the drama. Michelle was there, of course, as were many of the neighbors who had supported me through everything. Diane, the ever-curious gossip, even apologized for being too nosy during the ordeal. "You handled this with so much dignity, Ryan," she said, her voice unusually sincere. "I think a lot of us could learn from how you've carried yourself." I thanked her, though I didn't feel particularly dignified. I'd just done what I had to do, what anyone in my position would have done. As the sun set on that gathering, I stood with Michelle, watching the kids play in the yard and the neighbors laugh and chat. It struck me how much life goes on, even after the most painful experiences. The betrayal that had once consumed me now felt like a distant memory, a lesson learned rather than a wound still bleeding. Before I left, Michelle pulled me aside. "You deserve to be happy, Ryan," she said, her tone earnest. "Don't let what Claire did make you think otherwise." I nodded, smiling at her. "Thanks, Michelle. You too." Driving away from that neighborhood for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years. Claire's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, still moving forward, and that was all that mattered. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.